Mm, 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 mm. Ladies and gentlemen, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ear. What's up, Josh? Kurt Kennedy. This is Kurt's Corner. For those of you who are cross-examined listeners, thank you so much for listening to the show, Strack and I. We're actually not doing an episode tonight. I have been on a pastor's retreat all week and just recently got back. So I just wanted to spend some time with my kids. They ironically wanted to get out of the house and come to the church for right now. So we've been here for a couple of hours, but I'm going to leave in a moment and take them out to hang out with them. So there will not be a cross-examine episode tonight, but what I'm about to say now will have to suffice. Now I'm going to do something a little different than what I normally do. All right. I'm going to do something different right now than what I normally do because I want to make a point using real live data, real facts. All right. So there are two words in the Bible that describe every single thing that we're seeing right now happening in our culture. Two words. Now, I wonder what you would pick if you had a choice to pick those two words. And believe me, it's not the two words hate God, right? But there are two words that describe what is happening, everything that we see right now. But before we get to those two words, we have to look at these two scriptures real quick, all right? So here's the first one. The first scripture is Ecclesiastes 1:9. This is very important to the argument, right? What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. So this is a couple thousand years old, right? 4,000 years old. Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiastes. There is nothing new under the sun. All right. That's Old Testament. New Testament passage to look at, similar. 1 Corinthians 10a, kind of the first part of the verse, says this. No temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. All right. So nothing new under the sun. No temptation has come upon you that's different. It's common to humanity. All right. So there are two words in the Bible, two words that are in almost every credible translation, two words that describe basically everything that you and I observe on social media, through what's happening in the political world. Everything that we see happening right now are two words in the scriptures. Now, in order to understand that, we're going to do something different than what I normally do. We're going to go on a history lesson, all right? Brief history lesson, because you will not appreciate these two words unless you see how they've played out in real time. Now, usually when we talk about American history, especially the last 10 years, right? Everything has been about racism. Everything's been about racism, slavery, Jim Crow, and then you throw in socialism, right? Marxism, right? All this, and you get CRT. Well, that's been the common conversation, and what most people think about when we think about American history, even going into the 20th century. However, there is one term or one kind of ideology that is as important as all of that, as slavery, racism, maybe even more important to why we are where we are today. I assure you, it is not slavery and racism. Those are actually three words. But the two words I'm talking about in the Bible, we'll get to in a second. To understand the significance of those two words, we have to look at an important aspect of American history that is largely overlooked that describes why we are where we are today. All right? So to do that, we're going to look at three words. Now there'll be five on your screen, but they're three words. All right. The first is the Red Scare. All right. The Red Scare. Brief history lesson. I don't normally do this, but this is important so that you can see how the two words in the Bible that we're going to get to accurately describe everything that we're seeing right now in the culture. You guys are going to have super discernment by the end of this video. I'll try to be quick because I'm going to hang out with my kids and take them out. All right. I don't know how many of you are even familiar with the term the Red Scare, but here's what the Red Scare is. And I promise you, stay with me. I promise you I'm going with this. It's a history lesson, different than what I normally do. Stay with me. I promise you. We're going to get to something I think will be very helpful if you stay with me. All right. I'll try not to make a 30-minute video, but if I do, stay with me. All right. The Red Scare. Here's what the Red Scare is. The Red Scare was a historical phenomenon at the turn of the 20th century, right around 1919. All right. Let me tell you what the Red Scare is. What the Red Scare was a national fear of communism. All right. It was a national fear that Americans had of communism. Okay. So let me explain to you what communism is. I'm gonna give you the definition, the legal definition. All right. Communism is a theory or system of social organization in which all property is owned by the community and each person contributes and receives according to their abilities and needs. All right, so that's communism. Well, America is a capitalism. We're a capitalistic society, which is the opposite. So America is an capitalism, an economic and political system in which the country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. All right. So communism it's controlled simply by the state and not privatized, and capitalism is controlled privately and not by the state. And so the Red Scare was a legitimate phenomenon that began around 1919. So the World War I ends in 1918. All right. 1919, just after World War One, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks invade Russia. They invade Russia, and Russia becomes a communist nation, right? Communist nation, which is actually a socialist on one level. We communism and socialism are very close. It's called communism, but remember what the USSR was? It was the United Socialists, right? They consider themselves socialists, but that's for a different video. All right. So the Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin invade Russia, and communism has now taken hold in one of the biggest nations in the world. All right, not only did he invade Russia, but he was basically spewing rhetoric. This is the kind of stuff that he was saying. He was saying that communism should be a worldwide revolution, which essentially would end capitalism. And America, as a capitalistic society, was afraid of communism, right? So America is fighting against the idea, and this fear of communism comes. Now, here's why it became important. After World War One ended, the economy in America slowed down because when there was war, you have to make weapons, you're making vehicles, you're making ammunition. All these things disappear when there's no more war. So there began to be the inability to make money, and all of a sudden, people started to get concerned. There was a lot of unrest, right? You get a lot of what they call labor unrest. You started seeing strikes happening across. As a matter of fact, in 1919, the Seattle Steel Strike had 30,000 people that were on strike because they were not getting paid. And people were concerned, Americans were concerned, those in government, that they were becoming radical. Because one of the terms that was given to people who were communists, the Red Scare was red because of the communist flag, the flag of Russia. They were called radicals. So if you were called a radical, then I was essentially calling you a communist. And because people that were actually protesting, not because of communist ideology, but because they don't have money, they can't feed their families, they're starving, the war's over, and they weren't prepared for the lack of production that wasn't needed anymore. So now you have all these corporations that are becoming radical, and they seem like people were concerned that they would be communist sympathizers, all right? Right around that time, you had what's called nativism. And I promise you, stay with me. We'll get to what I mean. We'll see what we mean biblically, right? You get nativism. Nativism was just prejudice against foreign-born people. Now, let me explain this. This is very important because a lot of people get this confused as it relates to racism and immigrants. People say, well, my parents came, my great-great-grandparents came here with nothing, and then in a generation, they had everything. Blacks that grew up in America, there was the thing called nativism in America. There were white Americans, Anglo-Saxons that were here, did not like immigrants coming because there was a real concern, all right? Now, here was a distinction between what was happening. There were two kinds of immigrants coming. The older immigrants came from like Great Britain, Ireland, Switzerland, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, France, Belgium. Okay. These were immigrants that were largely literate. They were not as poor. They were mostly Protestant and Catholic, and they came from democratic countries, and they were quick to assimilate. They believed the American dream and wanted to get involved. But then all of a sudden, you had this new immigration coming to America. You had people coming from, they were still white skinned, many of them, but they were from Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary, Russia, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Europe, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece. These were all coming from countries with a history of communism, anarchism, and socialism. And so when America had a lot of nativism, which was essentially hatred towards foreign-born people coming to America, it had nothing to do with their skin color, but a fear of the ideology that they would be coming with, right? There was a fear of them because these immigrants were very poor. They were illiterate and unskilled. They were taking jobs from Americans because they couldn't do anything else. They were seen as inferior, and many of them were not Protestant or Catholic in their religion. So you have a whole wave of immigrants coming. You have Americans who are terrified of the communist ideology, communism, and communist sympathizers, radicals, which was perpetuating what was called the Red Scare. All right. To add insult to injury, you had all these bombs were mailed to different people in the United States government, right? Bombs were discovered, and it was a plot. 36 bombs, 36 of them were discovered and caught in the mail, sent across to many American cities. On one day, 8 bombs went off at the same time across America, and America was terrified of the communists are coming. Kind of like Paul Revere, the British are coming, the British are coming. There was a fear that the communists were coming. Well, one of those people who had a bomb targeted was a man named A. Mitchell Palmer, who Woodrow Wilson made the Attorney General. And Palmer was known for what was called the Palmer Raids. Here's what he did. He used the Justice Department to conduct a series of raids against people that they thought were communist sympathizers, right? These were suspected radicals that may be aiding communism and helping create an ideology. Now, Palmer was the one who hired a young man by the name of J. Edgar Hoover, who would become the head of the FBI some decades later, right? That's a different video. So Palmer and government agents, they rounded up and arrested people suspected of radical communism, if they were socialists, anarchists, all these immigrants, they were deported back to their countries, and many of them without any due process of law. And all of a sudden, it seems like America is going after the Red Scare, this fear of a communist takeover. But then a catastrophe happened, the Great Depression, 1929. The Great Depression happens, and guess what? Most Americans did not care about communism anymore. They cared about how were they going to eat food and feed their families, right? So this happens over, and then fast forward now 20 years later, there's a second part of the Red Scare. And you probably have heard the term McCarthyism, and if not, I'll explain what I mean. Stay with me. We're getting to a point where there's 2 words in the Bible that describe everything that we've seen this far. 2 words. Stay with me. We're getting there. There was an organization called HUAC, all right? This is what it's called. House Un-American Activities Committee. All right, this was started in 1938 to identify German sympathizers. So America was really big on fighting against communism, socialism, anything that seemed to destroy the economic way of life that America was known for. This was a big deal. And what's interesting to me is that what we're talking about is largely left out of the conversation of how we got here. We think of everything as black, white, racism, social justice, all this stuff. No. This fear of communism was gripping, okay? So let me keep going. Let me keep going with the history lesson. I'm giving y'all something. Y'all ain't know that the brother, the gangster, that had that history in him. Let me get you hip. We're going to get to these two words in just a minute. Here we go. So in 1949, so this HUAC, right? This organization starts in 1938. They're going after German sympathizers, anyone they think are radicals. They create a Hollywood blacklist of 10 people who were directors and popular actors and so forth that they knew were communists or sympathizers. They were afraid that these people would use Hollywood to pass messages that would make the country communist. There was a real, people were afraid of losing what we would call now sort of American civil liberties, constitutional rights, things like that, for the sake of communism. And then it got crazy. 1949, Russia gets an atom bomb. America didn't even know Russia had an atom bomb. And all of a sudden, they test their atom bomb and make it clear to the world that not only does America have an atom bomb, but so does Russia. 1950, China becomes a communist country and American fears are heightened. China now says that they are communists, and now you got two of the biggest nations in the world are communists, and America doesn't like either of them at this point and is afraid of being taken over and becoming a communist nation. So here comes the knight in shining armor, Congressman Joseph McCarthy. On February 9th of 1950, he gives a speech and says that he has in his possession a list of over 200 people working for the federal government, particularly in Congress, that were communist sympathizers, and it set the country on edge. Oh no, how do we have communists here? Everyone was worried about being a communist. Here was the problem with Joseph McCarthy and what we now call McCarthyism, is that he had no evidence. He accused people right and left, but he never produced any credible evidence. But as you and I know, you don't need evidence anymore. We've lived in a culture where we say innocent until proven guilty. We all know now it's guilty once declared guilty, and you got to prove your innocence, right? So as McCarthy, even though he had nothing to show for it, the mere accusation of communist or radical became a big deal. And once you were called that, it was a public relations nightmare. If you were called a communist, you could lose your job, you could lose everything that you have. And there were times you just rightly didn't agree with the government. If you disagreed with McCarthy, he would just call you a communist. So this went on for a few years, but then he got his foot put in his mouth. Here's what McCarthy did. He went after the army, because they were promoting a man who was a dentist to become a major. And it was a law that was passed. And McCarthy said that man is a communist, and whoever promoted the law that would promote this dentist to be a major in the army was working for the communists. Well, guess what? Guess who actually wrote the law and made the law? McCarthy himself. You idiot. You idiot. So then they have on TV the Army versus McCarthy hearings, and the whole country got to see that this man is somewhat of a fraud. He had no evidence, nothing there. And once the hearings were over, the idea of McCarthyism and the Red Scare began to disappear. Now, people were still worried about communism. We got the Cuban Missile Crisis with John F. Kennedy in 1963, like in the early 60s. That was a real concern. They were afraid that, because Cuba was also a communist country, and Russia was trying to bring a submarine there, which is very close to America. So this idea of being a communist, now I didn't grow up in the 60s. Some of you may have. But they were doing stuff like their fire drills were hiding under their desk because of a nuclear bomb or an atom bomb. There was a lot of concern that Russia was going to drop this bomb. And so everything was competing with Russia. First to get to the moon, first to do all these things, right? The idea of America becoming a communist nation or becoming second to a communist nation became a big deal. But once Joseph McCarthy, was proved to be a fraud, America started to shift away from so much of the radical fear of communism, but it didn't really go away. It didn't really go away. And here's what was really important. All those immigrants that came from those countries that I named earlier, they were undesirable countries to America because they feel like these people are coming from communist ideological nations. However, when those people, the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, and these people, they look white, but they weren't Anglo-Saxon, they weren't Americans. When they proved to not be communists, they were eventually welcomed into the fold of American society. And the shift went less about the immigrants coming from these countries that are largely white countries to now back to black people. Now, the civil rights movement became the radicals. Martin Luther King was called a communist or a Marxist, right? A lot of it shifted towards now, okay, these are the people who are the radicals now. These are the people who are the communists because they're pushing back, they're causing problems in the country, and we know what the civil rights movement was. All the immigrants, though, they were embraced into the culture. So this is a quick sidebar. So when I hear people say stuff like, well, my grandparents came from Scandinavia, and then in a generation they got them. Yeah, because the prejudice against those people was nativism. It was a fear that you're coming here to be a communist. Once you were here for a generation, you raised some kids, you paid your taxes, and there was no activity of you being that. You were accepted into the fold of being an American. You were a part of white America, so to speak. You weren't a threat anymore. In fact, the mafia, some of them dudes were superstars. They were famous for their crimes, but they weren't communists. That's what the majority of America cared about. Once they had no concern about those immigrants, it went back to black people being the big deal. Asians as well. Asians were also accepted into, because when China became a communist nation in 1950, America wanted to be more welcoming to Asians to push back against the notion that all Asians were communists. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember when I grew up, there were not the distinctions of Koreans and Japanese, and everyone that looked Asian was Chinese. They were all just considered Chinese because in America's mind, if you looked Asian, you were Chinese. And so all the welcoming of the Asian community was partly one, we did an atom bomb on you guys and we're sorry. Remember when Japanese people were locked up in these prison camps in the West Coast because of fear of communism and retaliation for that? All those, they got welcomed in because America, for public relations, international public relations, needed to show that they're sensitive to Asians because China had become a communist nation and America was afraid of communists. This was the history that many of us don't talk about of how we got to where we are today, that there was a significant fear of communism that lasted for some time. So now, having said that, what does that have to do, all of this, with the two words in the Bible? Now, I'm not going to even move into modern day stuff. I'm not even going to get into civil rights stuff. I've talked about that. There's plenty of time to talk about that. This is helping you understand the two verses that I put at the beginning. Let me put them here again. Ecclesiastes 1:9. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. All right. 1 Corinthians 10:a. No temptation has come upon you except what is common to man. All right. Having said that, what are the two words that describe in the Bible everything that I just explained and everything that you and I see on a consistent basis in our social media feeds? Here it is. Here are the two words listed here. This is 1 Timothy 6, verse 4. Here's what he says. He is conceited and understands nothing, but has an healthy interest in disputes and arguments over words. From these come envy, quarreling, slander, evil suspicions. All right, here are the two words, and these are in your translation. If a credible translation will probably have these two words that describe everything I've just said and what we're seeing right now happening in our culture. It's the last two words of this verse, evil suspicions. Evil suspicions. Think about what we just walked through. What I just said is pure fact. You can go back and look at, and everything I said, this is not left or right or Marxism or jokesism. This is none of it. This is straight American history truth. You can look up, there's tons of information on this stuff on YouTube University, anywhere you want to look. Many of you are familiar with a lot of what I said, particularly if you're older, right? So this is all historical fact. Think about it. A fear of communism and calling people communists and radicals created a culture of evil suspicions. People would be called, people were watching what you watched on television, what you read in the newspaper. All these things were gripping American society. It was almost like the Salem witch hunts. You could be left-handed and you were a witch if you were left-handed, right? There was a witch hunt which was due to evil suspicions. People were suspicious of, and it was evil because there was no just cause except fear. Evil suspicions have done a considerable amount of damage. Now, here's why this is important. Because oftentimes when you and I, and maybe you don't do this, but I'm going to assume you do this for the sake of this video. Oftentimes when you and I read the Bible and we see a list of different things, they just become a list of different things. And we see them mostly as a list of things not to do, but separate from and isolated from how is it impacting society. I find it fascinating that just 2 words in the New Testament at the end of a verse that Paul was writing to Timothy, inspired by God to write these words, he chose evil suspicions, and how much those 2 words have had a dramatic impact on the shaping of America as a nation over the last 100 years. And evil suspicions have worked their way up into Marxism, calling people woke, calling people every single thing. Fear of losing the comforts of the nation, fear of socialism, now not communism, but Marxism. All of these things are not new, brothers and sisters. You and I may have not been alive, and you and I may have forgotten, but these things are just recycling themselves in different language, different styles, different technology, but it's all recycling the same fears, the same evil suspicions that are happening. And you and I, if we genuinely are true believers of Jesus, have an obligation to not allow ourselves to participate in this quarreling, slander, but most importantly, evil suspicions. We see it all the time. We see it all the time. All you got to do is say, hey, I think this way. You're woke, or you're a white supremacist. Evil suspicions. When I scroll through my Twitter feed, evil suspicions. Scroll up my Facebook wall, evil suspicions. And people don't even know they're doing it. We're acting like we're discerning and finding something new, and God told us about it 2,000 years ago. And it's fascinating that the words that should describe America, as in trust Christ, actually are evil suspicions. May we, you and I, true believers in Jesus, may we not fall victim to it. It has a historical framework. So miss me with American exceptionalism, all of that stuff. Miss me with all of that. You know what's exceptional to me? The crucifixion. That's exceptional to me. The crucifixion is exceptional to me. Miss me with all of that. I see a history of evil suspicions. Not that America's all bad. Not that I want to live anywhere else. But I see the truth of what's happened. And I see the warning that God has said. And I choose to stay balanced and not have evil suspicions and slanders, because it doesn't honor the Lord. And look at the culture. If you want to change American society, stop using evil suspicions to evaluate people made in the image of God. You'll be surprised at who we could be if we did that. Oh, what do I know? I told you I wasn't going to be 30 minutes, but I can't talk less than 30 minutes. At least not when I'm giving you a history like this. Hey, thanks for listening. I know this is different than what I normally do. Just wanted to give you a history to show you how just 2 words of God's word, why the warning is real, because it shows us the whole thing of what we are as a nation. All right. Appreciate you guys. Thank you so much, man, for the comments that I get from you, Thank you. I apologize. It will not be a cross-examiner tonight. I'm getting ready to go take my boys out and go hang out with them. They haven't seen their dad all week, even though they wanted to come to the church and go sit next door and play their iPhones and iPads and all that. But now we're getting ready to go out and have some fun. So no cross-examine tonight, but Strack and I will be back next week with a banger. Thank you so much for supporting. If you like what you heard here, please like and subscribe to the channel. There will be some information there to how to support us, and we'd love to get support from you so we can keep doing what we're doing. Other than that, man, enjoy the rest of your week. We will see y'all, Lord willing, next week, and I'll be back with another Kurt's Corner either tomorrow or Saturday. Grace and peace, y'all. We'll see you.